So thank you all for joining us. So the topic of this panel is HPC challenges in your scientific work. And so our goal with this panel is for this to be driven primarily by audience questions. So you may have seen there was that link in the Slack yesterday encouraging you to post and upvote questions so that our intrepid panelists can answer them. I'm going to start with just a brief introduction so you know who our panelists are today. I am your friendly moderator. That's what happens if you let your 5-year-old take your portrait. I introduced myself yesterday, but I'm a computer scientist at the statewide California Earthquake Center, and so I run seismic hazard simulations on large suites of earthquakes. I realized I should probably mention that my terminal degree is a master's. I am one of the least educated people in the room. And I'm also the chair of SIG HPC education chapter, so I'm very interested in matters of education and training and outreach. I'm going to let each of our other panelists introduce yourselves. Feel free to do so from your seats, but I will make your slide appear. So first we have Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom from the University of Utah, and I do force field validation, optimization, and assessment, and molecular dynamic simulations. And I started out in computing at a very young age. In high school, we had a PDP-10. In my college, we had a VAC 780. I got a major in chemistry and also in math and computer science. And then after undergraduate, I worked at Harvard on the Connection Machine 5, the CM2, MassPAR, all sorts of early parallel computers. And then I decided to combine the chemistry and the computing and went to graduate school in pharmaceutical chemistry at University of California, San Francisco. And actually, I went as a graduate student to various summer institutes, like a summer institute at Los Alamos. We learned about vectorization of crays. PSC Summer Institute in Parallel Computing, the workshop in heterogeneous computing, and eventually I was teaching at workshops at Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center. And then NIH postdoc, it was the Beowulf era, and we had an IBM SP2 there. And then I went to University of Utah in 2000. We had an IBM SP2 there, but then we went to the kind of standard clusters you see today from Dell or Atipia. And I always got criticized for doing way too much service throughout my faculty career. But one of interest, which is up here, is the CARC group, which is the Campus Research Computing Consortium, which is a group advocating for research and computing data professionals throughout, job families, capability models, and we have monthly virtual meetings on various facing topics, like systems facing, so sysadmin topics, or data facing, or leadership facing. And I'm the chair of that group. For like 7 years, I was the interim chair, then I got elected chair for a 2-year term, and they won't let me leave, so I'm still doing that. But feel free to talk to me about it. I also became 11 years ago, director of our High Performance Computing Center.
Thank you, Tom. Next up, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. So, I didn't come from a computational background. Actually, my undergraduate degree was a Bachelor of Science in Human Biology, so I know a lot about human anatomy and physiology. I didn't actually do any coding whatsoever until my honours degree, which is like an additional year of research in Australia. So it's like less than a master's, more than an undergraduate. I don't think it really exists outside of Australia. Anyway, so I actually did honours, worked as a research assistant, and then did a PhD all in the same lab. And so this was looking into the genetic cause of nerve and muscle diseases. So things like what Stephen Hawking had, for example, but anywhere from literally babies that haven't been born yet, paralysed in utero, to little kids, to adults, to people in their old age. So it was really interesting, and it was very translational, helped a lot of people. I did a lot of things in the lab, so I've grown cells, I've cut up people's muscle biopsies, I've collected DNA from saliva samples. Don't recommend that. But now, because genetics is increasingly computational, I got a lot of bioinformatics and computational experience that way during my PhD. And started working for Pawsey. I had a concurrent position of like postdoc and working for Pawsey, supporting life scientists doing their research. Traditionally, HPC has been more aimed at, physics, chemistry, doing big simulations, these types of things. But genetics is really a growing field in terms of data and computational complexity, and so we need someone that can bridge that gap and, talk the language of both. So that's what I do at Pawsey. as a life scientist supercomputing specialist. And because I live in wonderful Perth, I can go to Rottnest anytime I like and take a selfie with a quokka, which is also the name of our supercomputer, Cetonics, right? So I just thought I had to throw that in there when I was looking for a fun picture to put in. Seemed very appropriate.
Now you're just showing off.
Sorry.
Samantha.
Yeah, hello. So I'm Samantha. I work as an application specialist at CSC in Finland. And I started there as a geoinformatics specialist, which is also my background. So it's geoecology and geoinformatics. And I started as a HPC user maybe 7 years ago, which is about the time when I also started my PhD. So I was a user of programs that were already there. Then I noticed that that was not enough, so I had to start writing my own. So I learned about Linux, I learned about Python and all these things, and I got really excited about these. And then I visited a code refinery workshop, which is all about everything around the programming part. So how to use version control and why would you want to, how to write nice documentation, modular code development, and so on. And that helped me so much personally and also for my PhD that I really wanted to get involved there. And through that, I also met a lot of people working in HPC and got really excited about that. And in that way, I'm now working in user support, supporting people that are doing the same thing where I struggled with like 7 years ago. Do training, write documentation, help with the research infrastructure. And yeah, I'm nowadays also a board member of the Nordic RSE community. So if you're interested in research software engineering and live in the Nordics, then please become a member.
Thanks. And finally, Michelle.
Hello. You heard from me yesterday, so I'll just tell you a few things that are different. I mentioned yesterday that I do machine learning for accelerator-based physics experiments. And in particular, I'm interested in uniquely structured data and uncertainty quantification in machine learning, whether it be like stochastic modeling or Bayesian statistics with machine learning. I got my PhD in 2014. And then I applied, or I did Bayesian neural networks to make predictions on physics data. And at that time, we didn't have the machine learning packages that we have today. So most of that work was really thinking about how we have huge volumes of data coming from these physics experiments. So how can we utilize GPUs to speed up the training processes? And the sad face is not because I did not like my PhD. I actually really loved my project. But I defended April 1st, April Fool's Day 2014, which is right around when TensorFlow was released. A little bit later, we had PyTorch and then TensorFlow probability, so no one should ever look at what I did for my PhD because they did a much better job. I get to collaborate with all different physics labs, which is just fabulous because I get to learn a lot about a lot of different physics. And in my free time, dancing is my favorite thing in the entire world. I perform hip hop, and I learn some K-pop dances just for fun, but I don't really perform them in a serious way. And I love going to India, as you can see on the bottom, and those are two of my best friends. So those are the things I enjoy.
Thank you. So please, if you haven't already, go ahead and pull up the Slido. You can either use the QR code here or the link that's posted in Slack. And let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions. So yeah, let's see. I think this first one is a good one for us to kick off with here. What tools in the HPC context do you think have been most useful for you to learn?
To repeat myself for those of you that were in the container session, well, containers, one, very useful, I personally think, for bioinformatics. Two, workflow orchestration managers such as Nextflow, SnakeMake, Airflow, Dask. I really only know Nextflow or SnakeMake, but the other two also exist. I think they're really very, very useful for making sure that the work that you do is reproducible and version controlled and just efficient. You know, if you have a big complex thing that you need to do that has many steps and you want to farm out all these jobs to Slurm, Nextflow can do it for you, and it's really great. So I would recommend if you have something in that shape of compute.
Yeah, for me, same as Sarah, but also version control like Git was really, really helpful when I learned about it. Not only for HPC, also in general. Yeah, I would add that.
Yeah, when you're talking about like learning version control, do you mean kind of just that Git exists, or are there certain Michelle made a face? Are there certain kind of features or aspects there, like above and beyond its existence and its basic usage, that you found to be particularly helpful?
I'm a big advocate of properly using version control. I think a lot of young people, if you're working on a code base where there's not a lot of contributors, then it's easy just to make things work for you. But if you learn how to do things the appropriate way, then it really makes your life easier. And if you then go into an environment where you're contributing to a code base of many contributors, then that transition is much easier. I fear that most people just learn the hard way when it comes to version control, so you really mess things up and then you realize that you need to do things properly. But there's a reason that it exists, and there's a reason why Git has really persevered as a very common tool to use, and it's not just so you can push and pull from main all the time, so proper use I advocate for.
I'd say Git as well is a really important tool. Continuous integration. You'll hear about some of these techniques from Eric at his software engineering talk coming up later.
So I think one thing, this next question kind of reminds me of this, right? I think one thing that many of us that have worked with HPC tools and technologies have discovered is there's often, you want to use a new tool, you don't necessarily know anybody personally who's using it, and so you pull up the documentation, you try to find some tutorials, you spend a long time on Stack Overflow, and then eventually maybe you figure it out, or sometimes maybe you don't. And so, I like this question about, do you have any suggestions about how long you should kind of bang your head against the desk trying to figure it out on your own? At what point should you ask for help? Maybe your colleagues in your lab or someone at the local center, or reach out to someone you don't know yet?
I say always ask for help, and there's a rich set of resources both nationally and at various centers of people you can ask questions to. And there's various forums in Slack and on email, Campus Champions in the US, which you can ask questions about. Has anyone ever used this software before? Can you help me out? And those kind of questions. So there's a lot of rich sources out there.
I'd say I agree with that, but also give it a red hot go yourself. I don't know if that translates. That's something we say in Australia. Give it a good shot so that you can ask intelligent questions. You don't want to be that person that fires off an email and it's like, did you engage your brain before asking me? So think about it. Do I really need, have a go? Do I really need to ask this person this question? Sometimes just sit on it for half an hour. I say this in a harsh way because I've been that person. I really annoyed my poor PhD supervisor. So I always think now, do I really need to ask someone? And if I do, I'll do it. But if I don't, sometimes you just need to sit back and think about it a little bit first.
But I'd also say that I'm an Amber software simulation developer. It's a suite of programs developed by about 12 different research groups, 12 to 20 in the world. There's a lot of stupid questions that come across our email list. And what I really hate is one comes from my student in my lab, and then I just go yell at them about that.
I have some, I think there's a low barrier to asking questions. When I do exit interviews with all my research students, and the two most common things that they learn, which surprise us at first, and now we've been at it a while, is they learn to ask for help, that it's not such a scary thing. And the second is that they learn the power of collaboration, because a lot of times people want to just chug away on their own. Maybe they got into computation because they liked working on their own and problem solving on their own, but that's not always the best way to do things. But personally, when I'm wondering about asking for help, I first ask myself, like, why am I hesitating on asking for help? And if the answer is that I'm nervous that someone will think I'm stupid, or like maybe I don't want to bug this person, or if it's something like this, like, just ask the question. So my trick is I always ask the question to myself in my head. It actually happened this morning. I almost asked the question in the OpenMP session, and I try and answer it for myself. And sometimes, in that case, it was true. I actually did know the answer. So I asked myself in my head, and then I'm like, okay, how would I answer if someone asked me? And then I was like, crap, you actually know how to do this. You were just feeling a little lazy. And that's really the only time I don't ask the question.
And in many ways, it also helps to check if there's different ways of asking questions. Like many centers offer like a ticketing system where you send an email and then someone looks at it and sends you an email back. That might not always be the most easy way to ask your question. Some centers also offer like these virtual office hours, for example, where you can then go and share your screen and actually discuss with the person on the other end. That might also help a lot. So always check out if there's like different ways of also asking the questions.
Thanks. I think these two here are kind of related. It was this one and one before about kind of when to know about when you should maybe give up or change directions on the project you're working on. And I think that also kind of goes along with the any advice for when you don't believe in your work anymore. Have you had those moments kind of, working through your projects or your tasks where you weren't sure if you were on the right track, if you needed to switch? Maybe you did switch, maybe you didn't switch. Do you have any advice for students that might find themselves in that boat at this point?
Yeah, I had actually, I think I wrote it there that I'm still doing my PhD and that now for 7 years on part-time though. And in the meantime, I had a lot of projects that really ended up in nothing. So much of that time was spent on exactly thinking about this. Should I give up now or should I continue? And what helped me most was then to talk people in the same project, to see, do they have any advice for me? Is there maybe, you mentioned changing direction, like not giving up, but maybe tweaking it a little bit. Can it go a little bit in a different direction to still go on and maybe you can get something out of it? So I would suggest to talk to your peers about it.
I think the first one maybe needs a little context because I think if you're a student and you're working on a PhD project, then giving up on a project is different than if it's like your job that someone told you to do. And so I'm thinking maybe it's the student's perspective. And in that case, I've definitely given up on a project because I mentioned that I was a computational biologist for a little while and I realized I didn't like it. And it was really hard to switch projects. I had to switch advisors, of course, and it felt like a real breakup. Like a relation. It is a relationship that you have, and it felt like a breakup, and that was challenging. But in the end, it was best because I did not want to be a computational biologist. So that was a big change, and maybe that relates to the second one, although. Both of these maybe need a little context because if you don't believe in your work anymore, like from a very fundamental perspective, like you're having moral qualms or something like that, that's a pretty serious issue. If it's something like you don't believe in yourself with your work or something like that, that's a different story. So in my mind, the two things I always say the most when I teach is confusion is the sweat of learning. So if you're confused, you must be learning something. And failure is an opportunity for growth. So I think that failing is one of the best things that we can do to grow as people and to make the most out of what we're capable of. So don't be afraid of failure. But if it's something more fundamental, like I don't want to do this anymore, then that's something you should take seriously.
I'm going to cheat a little. It's not up there at the moment, but I was looking over some of the questions that have been submitted beforehand, and there are a couple of questions related to issues of reproducibility, which I think is a good one to talk about, especially since the four of you, are at various stages of your careers and may have more experience with this than the students. But what are your thoughts about how to approach reproducibility? And I'm going to leave this open-ended. Do you think that the kind of discussion of a reproducibility crisis is overblown? Are containers the answer? We've got you here, Sarah, right? You just talked about this. What are your thoughts about reproducibility and about how students should be approaching it?
This is a very strong focus in my lab, that what we do is simulations of molecules moving as a function of time. And if you just do one simulation, you can't really tell what it means. You've got to do multiple independent simulations with different conditions and show they all do the same thing. So we always have at least 3 independent replicas, if not up to 100 or 200 independent replicas. And we run them longer and longer and longer and see if we can converge the properties of interest. And we have been able to do that in the last 4 or 5 years, where we couldn't do that until that time period because of the GPUs and ability to run large ensemble simulations. But it's critically important to be, there was talk about code, like should we put the code in a container for reproducibility? We don't do that. We just have a rich set of modules and make sure that when the code changes, the results don't change. But they do change.
Yeah, I mean, I think reproducibility is definitely important, not just in a computational sense, but also like scientific reproducibility. So if you're someone working in the wet lab, like having good experimental design so that, you have a decent amount of replicas or whatever, and that kind of academic rigor. Not so relevant for this context, I guess. But yeah, I think reproducibility in terms of software comes down a lot to documenting what it is that you did very well. So if you're in the wet lab, you keep a lab notebook of all the things that you did and the protocols that you followed and the concentrations and amounts and this sort of thing. It's a pain. Everybody hates doing it. But what I learned is never think that you'll remember, because you 100% will not. That is a lie that you're telling yourself because you're feeling lazy. Do not trust your memory. And same with what you've done in terms of your analysis. Like, you should really try to use Git or something like this to document all the stuff that you did, down to the versions and this type of thing. Because, well, again, this is coming from a bioinformatics aspect or angle, but the versions of the tools that you use will change, but also those outputs can change. Sometimes even if you have like a different underlying version of R, the results will change, and that's important. So if you're trying to do scientific reproducibility when you have multiple batches of data, but you've changed R versions in between, it's not the same, and that's not rigor. So trying to keep a lockdown on that, I think, is important. And so containers can help with that, not to belabor the point, but it's more about like how you approach your work, I think. And it's not easy. Like, it's easy for me to pontificate about it, but it's a lot harder to do, and I definitely am not always amazing at it either, but it's definitely worth trying.
The other thing is making data available so other groups can reproduce it is a quite important thing, and that's challenging in my world because the data is big. It's got all these atoms and water molecules and things, but we share it, and people have gotten new insight out of our results that we didn't have before, and that's good for the community. And the other thing we do is in our papers, we put all the analysis scripts into the supporting information so people can see exactly how we did the analysis and reproduce it.
Yeah, I think reproducibility is at the core of what science is for the scientists here, and not just data availability, which is important if you can in your field. Not everybody is able to, but also documenting any choices that you've made to get your results and making them available to others so that if they had your data set, if possible, they could truly get those same results. And so I think like those of us that review papers, that's one of the things that we check is, are you providing all the information necessary to reproduce these results?
Yeah, and it can also guard a little bit your time. Like if you're working on something and then at some point you maybe leave the lab or you go somewhere else or you want someone else to reuse your stuff, instead of having them all send you an email and asking, how should I do this? How do I go about this? Which version should I use? If you think about it early, you have it there already. You have it for yourself, so you remember it, but then also others can see it right away. They don't have to contact you. You can focus on doing more science and don't have to explain it over and over in the same way. And there's really, really nice tools that help with the reproducibility. And it helps to think about it very early in your project already.
So yeah, you mentioned there are some tools that help. So I was going to ask, we mentioned a few that can be useful. Obviously, being able to share your data, I think probably ideally putting a DOI on it or something like that, right? So it's kind of officially released, even maybe a lab notebook. But are there other tools that you've encountered that you find helpful for capturing the kind of metadata and provenance that is important for being able to preserve reproducibility in the future that you might recommend to others?
Right now, coming to mind for writing documentation, like of course you can start with a README in a Git repository, for example. But once it gets too long, can get really complicated to follow along. And then there's tools that actually help you with writing really beautiful documentation without much like having to know HTML or something like this. So you can write in Markdown, in RST format, and create really beautiful websites with code blocks that can be copied and so on to make it really easy for others to also follow the documentation. One of them is Sphinx that we always recommend for doing that.
You can also use, we mentioned DOIs, you can use Zenodo to get a DOI for a specific version of a code base. So if it's something that's evolving, if you're publishing results with a particular version, you can tag that, which is really helpful.
And I'd say tutorials, a lot of like our simulation programs have tutorials that can not only educate users, but they can use to test to see if they reproduce the same results.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. This is one too. I think if people have specific questions about reproducibility, feel free to either ask them or come up and chat with our panelists, because I know oftentimes the devil's in the details there, right? It has to do with kind of the challenges of your work, and that what you view as reproducible can also depend on your work as well, right? Are you going for binary reproducibility, or do you have a fairly large kind of margin of accepted results? I appreciate the academic, non-academic question. I think we're going to table that for a later session. I think kind of the resource fair on Thursday will be a great time to talk about that. I'm a little curious about, so this top one here is pretty open-ended. This is about debugging questions or debugging tips. I know for some of you, you may be doing that recently. For others, it may have been a little while. But do you have suggestions for ways to kind of, when you really have to get down and dig into the code to solve a problem, either specific tools or more general approaches that you found are useful to trying to untie the Gordian knots that HPC challenges sometimes provide?
Good old printf. We do a lot of. But there are various tools we have at our center that people can use to dig in, look at specific variables and do things. Often those have performance impacts or may change to the flow, but you got to check out for that. But still, I was old school for that.
I'm so glad you said that, because I always get hate for printing everything.
Yeah, I would say using interactive sessions instead of sending them away and being so detached from your job. And then some centers also provide a web interface where you can more visually also work with your data or check something out quickly.
I realized belatedly we probably should have started with this. But given that the topic of the panel is kind of HPC challenges in your scientific work, what do you see as the biggest HPC challenges in your scientific work? Is it some of this nitty-gritty, trying to get codes to run that you're having trouble with? Is it getting time on the systems? Where do you see the bottlenecks?
Python version changes, CUDA version changes. We refactor our code every time CUDA updates, and that's a real pain. Containers are not easy, Kubernetes and these kind of things. And the cloud is really, really hard to use unless you just want it for a web page. To do a parallel implementation took multiple of my staff, months to get it to work, where I could go to TAC and do it in a few minutes, or go to another university and do it right away.
Yeah, I think for bioinformatics in Australia anyway, I can't really comment in other places, but I think accessibility is an issue. Like a lot of these people don't necessarily need like 2 million 10 million core hours a year. And so some of the allocation schemes that we have for those that are annual can be a bit tricky for them to use, because it's really set up for people that, you're in control of how much computation you're doing every year. You're not relying on patient samples or this hot collaboration came up out of nowhere overnight, and all of a sudden you've got to scramble to do this thing before the paper goes out if you want to be included in this collaboration and whatever. And so I think that can be a bit of a structural issue that we are working on, but it's certainly a bit of a problem. And so how can you remove this systematic barrier? Also things like, I think, training is a big thing. Like in Australia, I think we're probably a little bit behind in terms of, educating and training at the university level for using HPC and for doing like really high quality bioinformatics. Like a lot of the best people I've met were trained overseas, particularly in Europe is the ones that I've met. And it's like, oh wow, they have like this whole 5-year course doing the thing and they're fantastically skilled. And so I think, integrating more HPC learning with those types of courses would be really good. Speaking the language, educating the users, same sort of thing. It's just they're a bit of a newer field, right?
I will say I think of Pawsey's particular training program as being excellent. So I think that you at the center have been working on that a great deal. But that's different than what's available through the universities.
CUDA versions also, but more seriously, that's the bane of my existence the past few years. But more than that, I think for me it's been adapting to different expectations with different positions I've had. So when I was a graduate student, GPU programming, like GPU programming was not so common. And so we got this, our institution got a big grant for this GPU cluster, but they didn't have a lot of users. So they really were begging everybody that was doing GPU programming to really test the system. And so I kind of had free reign to do whatever I wanted, as much as I wanted on this cluster. And then by the time I got my PhD, more people were using GPUs. And then I did my postdoc at Michigan State. They have a really nice HPC there with great support, but not as much freedom. So adapting to figure out what I can do. I can't just ask for any version of anything that I would ever want on that HPC. I have to use the modules that they have and all these certain things. But then there was also a more well-defined support system, so I just had to learn how to navigate that. And then becoming a faculty member at a small institution, they didn't have, when I first arrived, they didn't have anyone that was a Linux expert that was dedicated to research support. And so I was asking what resources were available, and they were just like, get whatever you want. And I was like, okay. So then I had to learn a lot more about the hardware. I had to buy my own cluster, and then I became a sysadmin for my cluster. And that was a job on top of, being a new professor. So that was really, really challenging for me in my first year as a professor, coming from a postdoc where there was a really well-defined support structure for HPC, and then me becoming the support structure for HPC for myself. I remember once I submitted a ticket to our IT system when I did a boo-boo trying to support my cluster, and the ticket went around to the point that then someone contacted me and said, oh, we have a ticket, we need a Linux expert, can you help them? But I submitted the ticket. So now we've gotten a lot better because there's far more professors doing HPC related work, and we have some dedicated staff, but it was a very different environment to go from having a lot of support to having no support.
I'm just curious about that.
Yeah.
So since you're somebody who's been kind of on both sides, you've had your own cluster that you've had to be a sysadmin for, and then you've also had plenty of experience running on clusters that are housed somewhere else. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about the trade-off between the two? When do you think it's good to have your own and deal with all the headaches that brings, as opposed to relying on the resources that the massive HPC centers can provide?
Yeah. So for us, we looked at available resources where you kind of pay to play. So in your grant, you would put some money towards having an allocation somewhere. And the issue with that was, for us, I didn't want to require that I had continuous grant support for this when I was a brand new professor, because that kind of gave me some added stress. And so I just wanted to start with a small system where I bought it with the money I know I have now, and then it's there. And we looked at, we priced out some cloud computing resources, but I do machine learning on large amounts of data. So one experiment, 2 weeks of data is 10 terabytes. And so, so we were burning through cloud resources or things like that. So, so for us, it was just having that peace of mind that it's not going to disappear on us.